After nearly 4 years since its previous major game, The Legend of Zelda made a grand impression on the new generation of consoles with the Breath of the Wild. Replacing the age-old dungeon traversal with shrines and divine beasts, the fresh approach gave new fans such as myself a familiar yet expansive experience centered on level/world design and simple gameplay mechanics, more about the brain than the brawn.
As Jack's favorite Zelda game and my runner-up, we figured it'd be a good place to start with regards to the Zelda series. There aren't too many bosses, but still enough to justify a ranking, so let's get into it.
While, yeah, sure, you can attempt to rank bosses based off of gameplay, that's boring. I figured for the core 3 mini-bosses, I'd do it based on how much of a hassle each of their Medal of Honors from Kilton were. Moldugas were only a count of 4 and decently fun. Tali were plentiful but gave me loads of gems, while Hinox and their subcategory Stalnox were plentiful and gave me kaput. It's worth noting, but also should be obvious, that we're not counting each individual red, blue, and black variant, rather just all 3 plus the Stalnox as a single combined unit. Nevertheless, there's nothing really different among the 4. Spam any of the good arrows, lightning, bomb, or even ancient if you're feeling frisky, and hit them in the eyes to stagger them to the ground. Stalnox are different, and I'll give them that. Their eyes pop out and are loaded with health, so bring along a Lino weapon or 2 to make quick business of them. I don't even have the slightest shred of hate for the Hinox genotype. They're just lame in comparison to the majority lame bosses of this game.
For the mini-bosses with a bunch of variations, we're grouping them under the banner of their strongest representative, such as in this case. This gameplay is pretty embarrassing since I forgot that you can fire ice arrows at their bodies to cool them down, so I just brute forced him using Rivali's Gale and Beybladed his rock crystal with a heavy weapon. Tali are mini-bosses, so it makes sense that they aren't that hard, but they literally have like one boring attack and just exist to give you money if you need it. I don't hate them or anything, and there are at least variations of them, but they're really unremarkable. This big guy here is the same in every way except for size and the fact that he's chilling in a huge lava lake. There's little else to say. I give the same amount of thought to fighting a Talus that I do to scratching my balls.
The best way to make a boss memorable is to have it be 1, scenic, and 2, taken out through unconventional means. In this game, just basically not generic combat gameplay. The winding sands of Gerudo would feel a lot more empty without the Moldugas, and they have their own sort of aura or presence that I really appreciate. The same rings especially true for the Big Daddy, Molduking, who's taken out in the same method with the bombs and sound baiting and such, but he's absurdly weak to lightning damage, so a high count triple arrow bow is about all you need to survive.
We're no strangers to disappointing final bosses, but I personally would take even Titan Joker from Arkham Asylum over this wet noodle-ass boss. Compare this to the epic showdown with Ganon and Twilight Princess, and it's even more apparent how lackluster of a finale Dark Beast Ganon is. Horseback movement always feels clunky to me in any game, but in Breath of the Wild I find it downright janky more often than not. A boss entirely fought this way is bound to feel frustrating and gimmicky, which is a horrible idea for a finale. It's not that difficult, if anything this fight is mind-numbingly easy, but I still didn't feel in control for a lot of it. This form of Ganon looks decent, but Calamity Ganon was a far cooler look in my opinion, and that alone would have been a superior finale. He's above the guys below him because at least it has a cool setting and makes for a noteworthy set piece, but Dark Beast Ganon is assuredly a disappointing way to send players off.
Honestly, this fight is all over the place, and there's no definitive sentence I can think of as a base summary, so imagine clawing through a dozen rounds of those rats from Fallen Order to then be greeted with Beldorion the HUD as the resolution. In general, a boss easier than its preceding level comes with disdain after the fact, but Master Koga benefits from the terribly and unnecessarily hard stealth bits before him. Maybe this is just a me thing, but fighting with arrows is really satisfying, and that's in essence how you take him down. You'll be loaded with fire arrows for that extra bit of damage over the base ones, and by this point you guys should know I love Star Wars, and the ending portion with the metal ball felt sort of like dueling with the Force. There's nothing wrong with this fight, like at all, besides it being arguably too easy and passive to be engaging.
This fight is incredibly awkward, at least in the second phase. The cool introduction where he fires up his spear is promising, but my hopes for a competent boss were shattered soon after. Breath of the Wild in general suffered from a lack of dungeon items since those were always an important part of boss fights in the older games. Without them, most bosses consist solely of whacking them around for a while, which works in a game like Dark Souls where combat is a core component of the gameplay, but in the more exploration-focused Breath of the Wild it just feels lame. Phase 1 is at least tolerable, although I'm not too great at dodging him, so it was more of just a test to see if I could outdamage him or not. Phase 2 just sucks. The water rising restricts you to 4 platforms, none of which are within jumping distance of each other. He also hangs from the ceiling, so you're forced to use arrows or, if you're low on ammo, bombs. This makes it drag out way longer than it should, and considering he's the boss of the dungeon the game nudges you to do first, you're probably coming in here with pretty weak gear. Swimming just breaks the pacing and pisses you off when you're getting pelted by ice cubes since you're defenseless, so it's an all-around frustrating experience devoid of anything memorable save for my own annoyance.
I can't speak for Alex, but Bob Meadow is definitely my least favorite Divine Beast. It is a fairly rigged opinion, as my first time around I didn't get that you could just buy clothes in Rito. The second time I was buck broke on rupees and didn't feel like grinding rare or tally for him, so I figured I'd just go in nude and stave off the cold. And on my third run I was completely fine, just that the fight feels sort of all over the place. Don't get me wrong, it is fun. I like using bomb arrows and I love the slowed down mid-air action movie mechanic, but that's also all there is to it. If you have a high numbered Lionel bow or even a mid but multi-arrowed bow, you should have no issue whatsoever.
This is one of 2 things Jack and I disagreed on, and while I'm not the biggest fan of Windblight, Ganon, or anything, Fireblight is just more of a joke to me. I said Waterblight's first phase was just trading blows, but at least he fought back. Fireblight just gets bitched by Link at the point in the game where you probably fight him. Even in the Champions Ballad rematch where they make you fight the Blights with garbage gear, I still messed him up in like 30 seconds flat. The bomb vacuum thing he does in Phase 2 makes him even easier thanks to the lengthy stun a bomb puts him into. I can understand putting him here since he's at least not irritating in any way, but he's definitely way too pathetic for a main boss. He's nothing more than a 30-second road bump, and it's baffling to me how Daruk managed to fumble this fight back during the Calamity.
Going from all the easy and somewhat unassertive bosses in the previous 3 Divine Beasts and in between to a fairly hardcore test of skill in both Vanaboris and Thunderblight Ganon was like running into Artorias after drudging through the Royal Wood. It's a Nintendo game, it's not going to be made for the challenge, but I feel like almost any game with bosses has to have at least one mid to late game boss that upsurges the difficulty meter to stand out as a lone challenger among a field of detritus. There's not really a lot to the average playthrough's final Divine Beast Ganon, but it is far more potent than any other boss the game throws your way up till Hyrule Castle. Speed is the name of the game, and you are going to have to play to Ganon's tempo. As he zaps all over Nabora's central core like Anakin and Obi-Wan, you should never attack on your own and getting your damage by means of dodges. Learn from Benjamin Franklin, avoid using metal at all in this fight, and rely on Guardian or Lionel weapons and shields if you've got any. Like the previous 3, he has a short bit where you use the mechanic used in his Divine Beast, in this case Magnesis, and honestly this part's pretty confusing and sort of unnecessary. A buff in normal combat would have been a fine or even better substitute, but it's not the end of the world as is.
This fight is pretty decent, I'd say. Thunderblight Ganon was alright, but Monk Maz Koshia is where the bosses finally hit above average territory. He's got multiple phases and a varied moveset compared to most other bosses, which makes it feel a lot more complete and memorable. He's by a long shot the hardest boss in the game, owing mainly to his tanky health bar and high damage, but he's a bit tricky to dodge as well. Specifically, once he starts making all the clones, it can get hectic, and I found myself getting knocked around a lot during that phase. He oddly enough gets easier as the fight goes on, plateauing in difficulty in his second phase with all the clones and ending in his weakest form. He turns big, which looks more imposing, but is severely neutered in terms of threat level. This isn't a bad thing though, it's still fun, and difficulty has never been a major concern with Zelda bosses anyways. People have likened Maz Koshia to a competent version of Master Koga, which is understandable seeing as they both summon Sheikah ball things to attack you with. Gameplay-wise, he's probably a little more advanced than Calamity Ganon and definitely more of a challenge, but I must admit Maz Koshia looks way less cool than Calamity Ganon and has a lamer theme and arena, so I had to give Maz Koshia the lower spot of the two.
This might be the most obvious number 1 boss we've ranked yet. It's like going from blue cheese to mozzarella. Not only is Calamity Ganon my favorite looking Nintendo boss, but he's baller in all facets of what makes a solidified great boss. He accomplishes something bosses in a certain Soul series do consistently in feeling like an impossible challenge and putting the player in a slump of discouragement by having a health bar and damage output so gargantuan it feels almost unfair but doable with control and practice. It's what a final boss should be. It checks you to see if you're up to par in the major gameplay elements such as parrying, evasion, so on and so on. While most final bosses tend to be epic by hitting Zenith through a mixture of all their mechanics being long or being difficult, Calamity Ganon is a mixture of everything. He has all the different weapons utilized by the Guardian Scouts, the Eye of a Guardian, and a moveset featuring elemental abilities from each of the 4 Blight Ganons. It's really truly the ultimate test of skill. You have to have decent expertise in all combat and rune mechanics to bode well in the high-flying and action-packed gameplay. Rarely does Nintendo pull off such a monumental masterclass as they did with Calamity Ganon, so here's to an even better climax in the soon-to-be-released sequel.
Thanks so much for watching, and we hope you enjoyed. Next week we'll be returning to Mario Galaxy to rank all 41 of the galaxies, so be sure to tune in for that. That's all for now. Deuces.